Welcome to Tax-Aide California New Counselor Shared Training. This is case number 1 involving the taxpayer Glenda Alzinga. At this point, you should have read the student guide for the Alzinga case and completed tasks 1 through 3. As mentioned in the student guide, the next step is to watch this video. That's not the normal process. Normally you'll do the return, in this case the core case for Alzinga, in Practice Lab and then watch a video covering selected points. However, because you're unfamiliar with TaxSlayer, we're going to ask that you watch a long video in which we walk you through all of the parts of actually doing a case in TaxSlayer. Also, normally the video for a case comes in a single video with 3 parts. However, because of the length of part 1 for Alzinga, there are 2 videos. This is the first, part 1, and there's a second video, parts 2 and 3. All right, let's do the tax return. What you're looking at is the VITA TCE Springboard page, from which you can go into Practice Lab Pro Online, which is the production version you'll use during the tax season, or you can look at the blog that the TaxSlayer folks post periodically. You can put a shortcut to this page, vita.taxslayerpro.com, which is listed in your student orientation guide, or you can put a bookmark to a page later downstream. So let's click on Practice Lab. And that brings you to this page, which requires you to put in a master password, which is Train Pro Web. That's also in your student orientation guide. That's TRAINPROWEB, and I should have said that's all in capitals. Click on Login. And now we're at the sign-in page. Your student orientation guide described how to create a username account for you. So once you have that put in, the username is not case sensitive. You can capitalize it however you want to or not at all. The password, of course, is case sensitive. And click on Sign In. And then we're going to click on Go to the Practice area. There is a bit of useful information on this particular page. If you have some time, go ahead and play around with this, take a look at some of the things that are offered. But for the cases that we're doing, we're not going to point you to any of these extra material provided by TaxSlayer. So again, click on Go to Practice area. Here's the initial screen when you get into Practice Lab. This is called the main menu. If you were to click on main menu over here, you would get exactly the same thing. You have 2 options in Practice Lab. One is start a new return, and one is to look through the returns you've already created. We're here to create a new return, so over on the right-hand side, we'll click Select. Then we'll put in the taxpayer's Social Security number. You get that from the Social Security Benefits Statement, the SSA 1099. In this particular case, the taxpayer is not showing you their Social Security card because they don't need to. The SSA 1099 is a perfectly good substitute for a Social Security card as far as getting a Social Security number. You could also use a prior year tax return. That's allowable under Tax-Aide policy, but you don't want to do something like use the taxpayer's handwritten tax return from a prior year. You want something that looks like it was submitted to the IRS and accepted, because that's your goal here when you get a Social Security number, is to have the IRS accept that return, to have that Social Security number match the taxpayer's last name in Social Security records. So, to continue, we're going to put in 208 in tab and put in 3241. And then TaxSlayer wants you to do it again, 208 tab 3241. Ignore the available taxpayer profiles. Notice that the basic no profile option is a little bit darker shade of green. Those other ones are part of some functionality in TaxSlayer, which unfortunately was designed to save time, but actually is so poorly designed that using it doesn't save time. So unless for some reason your district thinks it does save time and trains you on how to use those other profiles, you always want to accept the default, which is the basic no profile. So we're going to click Start Return. You get this message that says Practice Lab is a work in progress. Click Continue. Most of the information that goes into the personal information page is straightforward. You're taking it from the intake booklet. The date of birth is a pull-down menu, pull-down list. So in this particular case, we're going to scroll all the way down to 1938. And then you've got a whole bunch of boxes, which again come from the intake booklet. You're looking for yeses here on the intake booklet. You're not seeing any in this particular case. But the important thing here, this taxpayer election fund comes from page 3. The important thing is box 8. Taxpayer wishes to elect to use their 2019 earned income. Even if they have no earned income, that is no wages or no self-employment income for 2021, you need to determine if they had 2019 earned income, because this could qualify them for the earned income credit. So you ask. Now you can preface that by saying you probably didn't work during 2019, or I need to ask this because it's standard for everybody. You don't have to ask about earned income. You can say, did you have any wages, or did you have any self-employment income from a business you ran yourself? But you need to ask this. If they, in this particular case, Glenda does not have any 2019 earned income. If she had brought her 2019 tax return, you could of course looked rather than asking. So you're not going to check that box. We'll do that in another case. So you go down here and enter address information, and when you enter the zip code, notice that that's before the city, 94116, and tab, it automatically fills in the city, town, or post office. That might be wrong. It rarely is. Sometimes the zip code has 2 different city, towns, or post offices, and the software takes a guess, but most of the time it's going to be right. So notice that it shows California twice. The second one is the resident state. If the resident state is anything other than California, you cannot do the state return. You can do federal only, but you cannot do the state return. If the person lived in California, taxpayer lived in California, part of the year was not residing in California, at the end of the year, you cannot do the California return. Part year California tax returns are out of scope. And of course, if they weren't there on the first of the year or sometime during the year, students accepted. You go, a student goes to college. That's not your resident state remains where you are for the whole year. But we do not do part year tax returns. The phone number is mandatory. That's what that little red asterisk indicates. So if the taxpayer for some reason doesn't have a phone number, that's rare, but it does happen, you need to get a phone number for a friend, someone that could be called if there's a problem with the tax return. That's pretty rare. Certainly the districts in California average less than 5% error rate. Some are much smaller than that. 5% means 1 out of 20 returns gets rejected by the IRS or California computers. So we do need a telephone number, or as we'll see later on, you can collect an email address, but it's mandatory. There has to be something in that field. When you click on continue, you will, in production, in the tax season, see what I call a jump screen, what's labeled California return. I'm going to show you what that looks like for 2020. The one for 2021 is not in Practice Lab until sometime in early January. And this is December, this is being taped. So you will not see that jump screen, but I want to show you what it is because it shouldn't come as a surprise in real life in production or later in January when you're using Practice Lab. And you are not in the California return, you are simply, Tax-Layer is collecting information that goes into the California return, and then it will continue after that page to work on have you work on the federal return. So I'm going to show you that right now. So this is what it looks like. It asks if the name was changed from prior year, and then asks about renter's credit and so on. We won't be working on this until the California cases toward the end of the series for this in this training program. So I'm not going to talk about this now. But again, I don't want it to be a surprise when it finally shows up. So when you click continue on that personal information page, you come to the third page in the basic information section that asks about dependents or qualifying persons. And in this particular case, there are none. So we're going to click no for dependents. Again, that comes from the intake booklet, the dependent section. And you're in the income section in the federal section. Before we continue with the return, I want to discuss an option. Instead of watching the entire video and then doing the return in Tax-Layer in its entirety, you can watch part of the video, then pause the video or leave the video noting where you are and come back. Then go into Tax-Layer, do some work in Tax-Layer, and then stop working in Tax-Layer and watch some more of the video. If you do that, then when you're in the Tax-Layer, you're going to want to leave, or if you time out, you'll be forced to leave. So let's talk about a planned exit. So you can exit via save and exit, or you can exit via your main menu, which you click here under your office, and that brings you to here. And then you have a log out, which is up here, and you click on log out. It says, are you ready to go? You click yes, you're ready to go, and you're back in Practice Lab. And we talked about how to go from this screen, Train Pro Web, and log into Practice Lab, and then you're on the main menu. But before we do that, let me show you a bug. It's possible because you've timed out in Tax-Layer, and Tax-Layer won't necessarily tell you that, but the next click that you make, you'll be pitched out of Tax-Layer, or you exit and it doesn't exit you to the right place, you're going to come to a different screen. Let me show you that. This is the problem screen. Logging into Pro Web is not the same thing as logging into Practice Lab. Pro Web is the production system. The username that you have for Practice Lab will not work in Pro Web. So this screen isn't going to get you anywhere except into confusion. So if you run into this log into the Pro Web screen, you need to go to Practice Lab. And you can get into Practice Lab via the vitataxlayerpro.com page, or you can get there via the bookmark page here. You put in Train Pro Web, all in caps. Sign in. Go to the practice area. So if you do want to go back into an existing return, you'll start from the main menu. You'll go into the Client Search section, and you'll look for the client name. There are a lot of shortcuts in production, or a lot of ways, I should say, features that will avoid having a lengthy list. By the end of the tax season, you'll have done 40 to you'll have done 40 to 80 returns perhaps. One of the ways is to check that says do not show accepted returns. Those are returns that have been accepted by the IRS, and there's no reason for you to need to worry about them anymore. If a return was started and there was really a problem with it, Maybe you used the maybe the taxpayer came back and said, I don't even want to use you guys, or whatever, walked out. You deactivate that return. Not likely to have very many of those, but you can avoid showing those. The other thing you can do is you can search. So, for example, obviously Glenda is showing here on the screen, but I'm going to do a search anyway. And as I start typing, all the non-matching returns vanish. So it didn't actually take a whole lot of keystrokes for me to see one return that I'm interested in, Glenda's. So when I get one way or another get to that return, I click on select. And that brings me into the summary print page. Notice the menu here has been compressed. I also had the option when I was coming into this return of actually picking one of those other destinations like the federal section, and then I wouldn't have had to wait for the tax return summary to come up. Before we start entering income into the federal section using tax documents like the 1099-R, there are two more items that essentially come from the intake booklets that need to be taken care of. One of them is the charitable contribution. In this particular case, you asked the taxpayer whether she had made any charitable donations, and she had not. But if the answer had been yes, here's what you would have had to do. You would have gone into deductions, and then into itemized deductions, even though the taxpayer probably isn't itemizing, and then into gifts to charity, and cash gifts to charity, because the special deduction for charity in 2020 and 2021 is for cash gifts. And cash is an interesting thing because it actually needs to be made by check or credit card. If it's physically a cash donation, you put it in the Salvation Army kettle, it is not deductible. It cannot be claimed because there's no way for you to prove to the IRS or the IRS to disprove that you made the payment. So check or credit card. So you click on begin here, and the easiest thing to do is simply to put in a total rather than to go through the itemization. The IRS only gets a total. The itemization that's available in TaxSlayer is only essentially to help the taxpayer keep records. It's a lot of work if there's a lot of charitable contributions to put them in individually. So click on the override button and put in a dollar amount. Now again, in this particular case, there isn't a dollar amount. The taxpayer did not make any charitable contributions, so we're going to click cancel. Continue is essentially the way to work your way up the menu structure. Here we're in itemized deductions. We'll click continue, and we're back to deductions. We're going to go over here in the left menu. This is probably a faster way to get out of the deductions than working your way back up the menus. So we would click on income to get back there if we were going to do start the income documents. But I said there are two things. So that was one, charity, and the other one is the RRC, the economic stimulus payments, which hides under COVID-19 relief here in the federal section. So click on that. There's a recovery rebate credit. Click on begin. So this was question number 10 in part 5 on the second page of the intake booklet. But it doesn't really matter whether the taxpayer said yes or no, in the sense that you have to go into the COVID-19 relief, recovery rebate, credit section one way or another. In this particular case, Glenda said she got the stimulus third round of payments, which is she specifically said when you asked her, she got $1,400. Notice that the TaxSlayer page mentions Form 1444C. It'd be nice if all the taxpayers brought that form in so that you could see, in fact, that they had gotten the stimulus payment. but they won't. So you need to ask them. If they're not sure, then you can go ahead and enter that you can say no, they didn't get that $1,400 or whatever that was that they were entitled to, and that has some consequences. One of them is it will slow down any refund. Number two is that the IRS will, if in fact the computers say they sent the stimulus payment, will adjust the tax return. You need to warn the taxpayer of that. So you really want to try to help the taxpayer as much as possible remember what they got. But if they can't remember, then you're better off claiming this and having the IRS reduce the refund than you are in having the taxpayer not get the $1,400 at all. In addition, in the interview notes, the taxpayer mentioned getting $600 from the state of California, which was unexpected. That's a complication. The Golden State stimulus payment of $600 is not from the federal government. In this case, the taxpayer realized that, but some taxpayers may not. And it is not covered in this question. So do not say in this particular case that Glenda got $2,000 result in any take back from the IRS, but it would be wrong. So, and in some circumstances, putting that $600 in would in fact cost the taxpayer $600. So we'll click continue. And continue, by the way, is TaxSlayer's way of saying save. Do not put something in and then click on the left navigation menu to go somewhere else, because you're failing to click continue means you didn't save. Now, at this point, however, you don't have to click continue. You can go over here to income. One final thing before we start entering tax documents. A brief advertisement for using the prior year tax return. Some of you may be surprised to see that in the student guide, but in fact that is the closest thing you're going to find to an answer sheet in real life, because a lot of times very little has changed between 2020 and 2021. And if very little has changed, then when you're done with your tax return, you can compare it to the 2020 tax return and see if there are any differences. But even before you do that, as part of the intake process, the interview process, you should glance through the 2019 tax return, because if there is income, for example, that's in the 2020, the prior year tax return, in which case is 2020, you would expect to see something similar. So if we glance at the 2020 tax return, page 1, you'll see that there's only two types of income: IRA distributions and Social Security benefits, none of which is taxable in 2020. And in fact, you have 2021 tax year documents that match that. You have a 1099-R and you have a Social Security benefit statement. So you're good to go. But if there were something else on the 2020 tax return, some taxable interest or some dividends or some stock proceeds from stock sales or income from a business, self-employment, then you would want to ask the taxpayer what changed. Why don't you have tax documents for 2021 similar to whatever that had to been in your 2020 tax return? And if they're not sure, they don't have a good answer, you do normally have the backup documents for that 2020 tax return, because it's typically brought in by the taxpayer as part of the packet from the prior year. If you do get a taxpayer who doesn't bring in the prior year tax return, you should remind them that it's very useful, and please, when they come in next year, bring their prior year tax return. In this case, bring your 2021 tax return, because it will help the preparer do an accurate 2022 tax return. And so on. That ends the advertisement for using the prior year tax return. Let's go and enter some income. So let's turn to that 1099-R from Liberty National Life Insurance. We started the income menu, and there's our 1099-R, Railroad Retirement Benefits, Social Security Administration. So this is your retirement income, and click on Begin. And so the options are add or edit a 1099-R. That's definitely what we want. And this is a standard 1099-R, not a substitute, so we can leave those boxes checked. And it notes that 2A is your taxable amount. So most of what you put into TaxSlayer is designed to mimic what you see on the paper form, but there are exceptions. I'm not sure there are any here, but it's not, your goal is not to put it in, not necessarily put it in 100% exactly the same. So box 1 is $22,078.93. So this is a good chance to learn about rounding. If something is 50 cents or a dollar amount is 50 cents or larger, 50 to 99 cents, you round up. And if it's 49 cents to 0, you round down or leave it at 0. You don't have to do that. TaxSlayer will do the rounding for you. But if you don't round, then you have to enter the decimal place and 2 digits. So you save yourself 3 keystrokes if you can mentally round numbers. So in this case, it's 22,079. And when I hit Tab, TaxSlayer fills box 2A taxable amount with the same number. Sometimes that's right, sometimes that's wrong. If it's wrong, you want to change it. In this particular case, it's right, so that TaxSlayer has saved you some work. Don't carry to Form 8880. It has to do with retirement savings credit. We're not going to cover that now. Generally, you leave that box blank. So payer's ID is the shown on the 1099-R as payer's TIN, taxpayer identification number, payer's ID. It's 95. Start that right. 95, and then it tabs for you. 960 4325. So this is a good point to talk about the fact that the recipient's TIN, taxpayer identification number, on the 1099-R is masked. There are 5 X's and 4 digits showing. As long as the name of the taxpayer and the digits that show, and the Social Security number or ITIN match, then you don't have to worry about the masking. But you do need to pay attention. 3241 is in fact the last 4 digits of the Social Security number for the taxpayer, so you're good. Now, after I put in those payer's ID and I go tab, the TaxSlayer fills that in. And the reason it fills it in is because it has in its database payer information here. In real life, most of the time when you put in a payer's ID, you will get the payer's name and address filled in. However, if it's an unusual payer, then TaxSlayer will not do that, and you're going to have to manually put that in. If you type in the payer ID and you think it's a common payer and you do not see the TaxSlayer filling the rest of the information automatically, that's a tip that you may have entered the payer's ID wrong, and so you need to stare at that a little bit. The other thing, of course, is you want to check this. So it says P.O. Box 3678, and that's in fact what shows on the 1099-R, and the zip code is 02109, and that automatically fills Boston, so we're good to go in Massachusetts. So we're going to continue on with other information. You notice that box 2B on the form is marked with a check mark, taxable amount not determined, even though there is an amount in 2A. So we're just going to mirror that. Why that's done, that's a good question, but it is done. This is not uncommon to see box 2B checked even though 2A is filled. And I'd say you can ignore 2B, but you should make the check mark just to mimic the form. So we keep going down 1099R. We see there's something in box 4, capital federal income tax withheld. You're generally speaking, if your browser is set to save figures, you're going to see a bunch of stuff which you can just ignore. In this case, it's 2207.89. We round that up to 2208. Box 5 is empty, 6 is empty. Box 7 is always going to have a code, distribution code. See the red asterisk? It's required. Typically, it's 7. Box the IRA SEP simple is checked, and we should check it in Tax-Aide. And now we're down to box 12, which is on the form, which is state or local tax withheld. That doesn't match the numbering in Tax-Aide, but it doesn't matter. You're focused on what the name of the fields are, not the numbers. So if in fact there had been no state tax withheld, then you would not need to enter anything in this section. You could save yourself some time. You can save the taxpayer some time by skipping the state information. At least in California, you can. However, in this particular case, we have some tax withholding. So we're going to put in 1103 rounded up is 1104. And we're going to select California. And when we tab, if the Tax-Aide, again, using the information that's already been entered, pulls that from the database. So that's correct. And the state tax distribution, I don't know if it's actually useful for anything, but it should equal box 2A, and it does in this case. And we are done entering information into this form. And if we weren't, it will come back and tell us we've missed something. So we click on Continue to save the information. And we come up with something that says basically, was this withdrawal due to a qualified disaster? And I'm not sure this is actually relevant, but we're going to say no because we're not doing spreading of the distributions across 3 years the way it was done in 2020. And we click Continue. So this is actually a new page. This page here, I'm going to click Continue to show you what's going on. I'm going to click Continue. That brings you back to this page, which we've seen before. But this time, when you click on Edit, it didn't say Begin, it said Edit. You'll see this grid that shows that there is already a 1099R in Tax-Aide. You can edit it, you can delete it, or you can go up here and you can add another 1099R. In this case, we only had one. Remember I said you click Continue to save, but in this case it's already been saved. So Continue is just going to move you up one level in the menu structure, which is actually where you want to go because we want to add a Social Security benefit. So let's check Begin for Social Security. We're going to use the SSA 1099, and here they describe the information to be entered, but don't actually put the box numbers. The first item to be put in is from box 5, net benefits. For if you're very unfamiliar with this, you may be tempted to look at the description of amount in box 3, which is on the Alzinga case is only $9,791.80. That is not what goes in here. The amount that goes in here is what's in box 5, and although it doesn't show in your student guide, that is usually highlighted in or tinted in pink. So 11,573 and 80, 11,574 rounding up. Taxpayers federal tax withheld, that is in box 6. In this case it's 0, so you skip that. That's not uncommon. Most people actually don't have federal withholding from their Social Security checks. And then finally, for the single person, there's your third field, and you are picking up the Medicare Part B premiums, which is $1,782. Sometimes there are two Medicare premiums, say Part B and Part D. In that case, you total them up and you write the total on the SSA 1099, so the person who's checking your work, the quality reviewer, can see that where that figure that you entered came from. So we finish entering Social Security, we click Continue to Save. We're back here in IRA Pensions Distribution, and now we want to take a look at the tax return in its totality and see how close that comes to the answer sheet. However, before we do, take a look on the left side in the navigation bar, and you will see that we now have two items under income: retirement income, which is the 1099-R, and Social Security benefits. What this means is that you can go directly to one of those forms without having to claw your way through the menus. So that's helpful. So summary print is down here on the navigation menu. Actually, there's one more place you need to go. You need, if you're going to finish the return, you need to go through health insurance. And the taxpayer did not purchase health insurance via healthcare.gov or a state marketplace. That would be Covered California. There's no indication of that. In fact, you know from the Part B Medicare that's how the taxpayer gets her health insurance, and in fact, because she's over 65, she is not eligible for Covered California. So the answer is no, and we'll continue to save and get a notice that the state returns are unavailable. We talked about that previously. So here's our summary print page. And it's probably worth mentioning at this point that there actually is a return summary on the far right of your practice lab screen, and that will be true of production also, that shows the adjusted gross income for the taxpayer and whether they're getting a refund or owe money on the federal return. I've left that off because it's not particularly useful while you're doing the return. You certainly don't want to tell the taxpayer, hey, you're doing pretty well as you're working the return, and then all of a sudden hit something that's going to change it dramatically. So no previews is a good general rule of thumb. Where that refund return summary is really useful is when you have discretion. That's not very common in tax preparation, but there are some places where you can do things a couple of different ways, and you make a note of what the refund is, federal and state, and you change something and you compare and see whether the numbers went up or down. So let's take a look at the tax return summary page. One of the things to note is there's a prior year comparison. If the taxpayer used the same site last year as they are at this year, then the prior year comparison can kind of give you a quick snapshot of what's changed. And as I mentioned, using the prior year tax return more or less accomplishes the same thing. It gives you a clue as to something has changed or that you missed something. So what we want to do is we want to compare the tax return here to what's showing here on the summary screen to what's on the answer key. And to my untrained eye, those numbers do in fact match the answer key. Notice that you have the Form 1040 is broken into parts. You're looking at the first part there. If we click on 2, you'll see the second half of this. This is not the 1040 senior form version, which is larger print and actually goes across 3 pages. This is the regular 1040. If you click on number 3, you will see the schedules. Let's see what we've got. Just Schedule 1. and if you click on which has no entries on it, it's not on the answer key, therefore answer sheet. And if you click on 4, you'll see schedules 2 and 3. At least you will at the moment. We'll see if that turns out to be the case after the draft forms for the new 1040 get implemented. So we're going to go back to page 1, and I want to show you a little bit about navigation. So there are 3 ways to navigate. We've been working using the left navigation bar. That's usually the best way to do things. But for the sake of completeness, one option is, let's suppose that you want to look at the IRAs, and so you come over here to this figure and you click on that, and it brings you to the IRA pension distributions page. So if you're looking at something you say, that seems very odd, you don't have to go through the navigation menu into income and into the pension or the retirement menu selection. You can come directly there. The other way that you could get around in TaxSlayer is to use the form finder. Now, let's suppose we wanted to look at Social Security. If you use that SSA, so it says go to form SSA 1099A there, and so here we are really quickly. However, finding a form, you have to kind of remember exactly what it looks. You've got a pull-down menu. If you know where it is, it's almost as fast, maybe faster, to click on income, and then, or if you've got it here, which we do on the side, you can go directly into the particular item. So form finder isn't useful generally, but sometimes you can only get to a form through the forms finder. So in those cases, it's obviously a critical value. All right, one last thing. We're going to exit this return because this video has been going on for quite a while, and you may not be going to do the expanded case immediately. But whether you are or not, there will be times when you're going to leave a return, or someone else is going to have prepared a return and leave it, and you're coming back into it to do quality review. So let me show you how you leave a return. Before I do that, under the same menu that I recommend, which is this taxpayer name, the way you leave is to click on your office. There's one other thing that is actually useful. Helpful Tools Quick File is not, and it's notes. So notes are where you leave information either for another day. For example, the taxpayer is missing some information, and you might put a note name that says missing info and then some text about what exactly is needed. This might be a note for next year, because notes do carry forward from year to year, and you're trying to tell the person, watch out for this, or you're trying to tell prepare. It can be a note to yourself that something needs to be done yet in this return. If you look in the Duck Book, there's a lot of places where it says leave a note. So if you're going to leave a note, again, there's a name for it. So this is going to be a test. Unfortunately, the user interface is really poor here, but this is a test, and you have a limited number of characters. You don't know how many offhand. This is only a test. If this were a real note, it would be more specific. And then, of course, you need to save the note. So you click here and you save the note. And then it comes up and says, I found a note. So I'm going to click Escape to hide that thing. And now I'm going to exit. Now you can click Save and Exit. Sometimes this throws you out of TaxSlayer entirely. I think actually it does. So if you come under here and go to your office, you'll be back at the main menu. So this completes part 1 of the video. Normally you would have done, in the other cases, you will have done the tax return, and you'll be watching the video just for some feedback of interesting points. This is the exception because you've never been in Practice Lab doing the tax return. So I've done the core case for you, and now it's your turn to go into Practice Lab and do the return, the core case, and check that against the answer sheet. And at that point, then you can turn to the expanded case, which you will not be watching on a video as it's created. You will be creating it yourself and then watching a brief, much briefer video that goes over, again, interesting or tricky points, but not the whole process. Please pause the video until you have completed tasks 5 through 7 in the student guide, updated the return in TaxSlayer for the expanded case, and checked your return against the answer sheet. So for the expanded case, there was a change from the prior information. Specifically, we're going to assume for the expanded case that the taxpayer checked that she had both dividend and interest income, and we do in fact have a 1099 INT and 1099 DIV. So for the expanded case, we're going to enter those. As I mentioned, hiding over here on the left, if I move my pointer over there, is the menu, and the 1099 div and INT go into the federal section. So we click on that. We're already in the income by default. INT and divs are in the same section. We click on begin. Interest and dividend income are in the same section, so we click on begin. And now we have a choice of the specific form that we want. The first is a 1099 INT, so let's click on here and click continue, and there's the form. And it turns out there's only two things I need to enter on this form. There's a payer name up here at the top, Navy Federal Credit Union, and there's the interest amount, which is $95 rounded down. I do not need to enter the taxpayer TIN or EIN. Notice there's no red asterisk here. I do not need to enter the payer's address here. I do not need to pick the state. I do not need to do anything else in any of these other boxes because they're all blank. And this information up here, the taxpayer, about the payer, is not required in California. There are some states that require this information to be collected on the state return. California is not one of them. So here's another opportunity to save time by not entering this information from the form, not spending your time, not spending the taxpayer's time. So we put the two pieces of information in we need because it's a very simple 1099 INT. Scroll down to the bottom here, it's a long way down. Click continue, and we've saved that form. So now we're here on the grid page, and we want to add another interest or dividend. This time it's going to be a dividend statement. We click continue, and here we are in the dividend. So again, we put in the payer's name, we skip all of the stuff in between, payer's EIN and address and state, and now we're going to enter whatever is the dollar amounts that are on the DIV form. In this particular case, there are 3 of them. Ordinary dividends are $100.49. We round down to 100. Qualified dividends are $89, rounded down from $89.11. And capital gains distribution is $25. So we'll put that in there. Scroll down to where we can click on continue and save. And finally, for part 2, I want to show you one other way of comparing your return to the answer sheet. So let's go back to that summary, scroll down to that summary print page, and you have the option of viewing printing the return, which really means that you can generate a PDF, which you have the choice of sending to the printer. I'll talk about that in a moment. So let's click on that, and it generates a PDF. Actually, it comes up and says, here's an opportunity to generate. Now this says print your 2021 tax return. That is a misnomer. That actually, again, will generate a PDF. It will not send something to your printer. So let's click on that. And you get a separate screen that has your 17-page return. So you can expand this. There's a plus here at 110, 125%. Let me start by saying I strongly recommend against printing this if you get to the point where you need to print a return for the taxpayer, because if you do, you're going to print a lot of extra pages which you're either going to have to give to the taxpayer and that's potential confusion, or you're going to have to shred. So there are other ways to print a taxpayer copy that have a lot fewer pages than just the pages you need. The pages you need for the answer sheet, if we scroll on down here, bypass all of that information, images of the 1099-R, the forms that the taxpayer needs to sign to authorize us to electronically file. We finally, on page 7, get to the senior version, because the taxpayer in this case is over 65. We get to the senior version, and there are some numbers here that you can check against the answer sheet. So this is an alternative to using those pages, the summary print pages that we talked about. So let's see, I'm not sure how I get back to this. I guess I go here to summary, and that gets us back to the normal, what we normally see with summary print. So this concludes part 2 of the Alzinga video. In the expanded case, the taxpayer had given roughly $5,000 to one of her children. The question is, what if it had been significantly more? And specifically, what if it had been more than $15,000? The reason we're talking about $15,000 is because if a taxpayer gives more than that amount to a person during the year, the good news is they don't owe any gift taxes on that. It doesn't change their tax return. The bad news is that requires a form which is out of scope for Tax-Aide. Specifically, a gift of over $15,000 requires filing Form 709. And if you look in the scope manual for Form 709, you'll see it down at the bottom of this screen here. You'll see that it is marked no, not being in scope. You could still do a return of this type if it were for a close friend or for a family member or for yourself, but otherwise you can't. You're unlikely to run into this situation. It's a fact that you might want to tuck away in case you encounter it in some unusual set of circumstances. But this is an example of something that could be out of scope, something unusual, of course. You may have noticed that while none of the taxpayers' 2020 Social Security income was taxable, in the core case for 2021, some of it was, and in the expanded case for tax year 2021, even more of the Social Security benefits were taxable. So how fast does that increase? So what specifically, if 2021 interest income was $1,000 higher, how much more of her Social Security benefits would be taxable? What if the taxpayer said she'd like to keep more of her money during the year and then, of course, receive a smaller refund, and she asks you how she could do that? First, this is an uncommon question. Most of the time, taxpayers are happy with how much they get. If they're getting a large refund, often they plan around that for a large purchase or just to put into savings. But sometimes it's possible they might ask how to get more of the money during the year and get a smaller refund. So the answer, of course, is generally withholding. Sometimes if there is a difficulty doing withholding, then estimated tax payments are the other possibility. That's generally undesirable. Besides the cost of mailing 4 quarterly payments, the taxpayer needs to remember to do that. Then the following year, you as a preparer need to get that information from the taxpayer and make sure that the taxpayer, if you can, really made those payments. In short, it's much better to have a withholding amount on a tax document like a 1099-R than it is to push the taxpayer in the direction of estimated tax payments. If the taxpayer is getting Social Security withheld, then one option is to change or start withholding federal taxes from Social Security. That's done on a form W-4V. You would need to print that out for the taxpayer. That's not part of Tax-Slayer. And notice that you have only 4 choices for withholding percentages: 7, 10, 12, and 22%, and no California or state option. But generally the easiest thing to do if the taxpayer has wages or some sort of retirement income on a 1099-R is simply to suggest that they call whoever the paying organization is, the employer, the trust company, whatever, and ask them to increase the federal and or state withholding. This is a very, very routine request. The taxpayer taxpayer should know that this isn't a big deal. They probably talk to that company, their employer, once a year because they may be changing withholding. So just give them a call and tell them what they'd like for withholding. Of course, it will start in the middle of the year, so you have to do perhaps a little tweaking, but it's generally best just to figure out what your final point is, assuming you had 12 months of withholding an extra $100, for example, and not worry about the fact that if you're doing the tax return in March, you're only going to get 8 or 9 of those $100 extra withholdings occurring during tax year 2022. This concludes the Tax-Aide California Shared New Counselor Training, case number 1 for tax year 2021, Alzinga. You're now ready to move on to case number 2.